When a young naval officer refuses entry to a gray-haired man at the submarine base gates, he believes he's just doing his job. The visitor insists he once commanded the very submarine docked behind them. But the officer sees only protocol and an old man without proper credentials. Tensions escalate until an unexpected call from the Admiral changes everything. "Let Captain Harris aboard. He built her." What begins as a reluctant escort transforms into something neither man expected. As the retired captain walks the familiar decks of his old vessel, memories of sacrifice, leadership, and loss resurface. The proud young officer finds his certainty shaken by stories of what true service demands. But what could possibly have happened aboard that submarine decades ago that still echoes through the steel corridors today? Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Lieutenant Marcus Morgan stood a little straighter as he approached the gray-haired man waiting at the security checkpoint. The morning sun cast long shadows across the naval base entrance, and Morgan could smell the familiar mix of salt air and diesel fuel that had become the backdrop of his life these past 3 years. At 28, he took pride in his position as officer of the deck at Submarine Base New London, one of the most prestigious posts a young officer could hold. His uniform was crisp, his bearing perfect, his sense of duty absolute. The older man wore civilian clothes, khaki slacks, and a windbreaker that had seen better days. No military bearing that Morgan could detect, though there was something in the way he stood that suggested a lifetime of discipline. Morgan glanced at his clipboard, then at the man's face. "Can I help you, sir?" Morgan asked, his tone professional but cool. "I'm here to see the USS Tempest," the man said quietly. His voice carried the weight of years, roughened by time but steady. "She's docked at Pier 7. Morgan consulted his list. "Do you have authorization?" "The Tempest isn't open for public tours." "I don't need a tour." The man reached into his jacket and produced a faded military ID card. "I commanded her for 7 years. Morgan took the card, examining it with the skeptical eye of someone who'd seen every trick attempted by civilians trying to access restricted areas. The photo showed a much younger version of the man before him. Dark hair instead of gray, fewer lines around the eyes. The name read, Harris, James R. Captain, USN. "This expired in 1997, sir," Morgan said, handing it back. "I'll need current authorization and proper identification to grant access." Captain Harris, if that's who he really was, didn't show frustration, only a patient sort of resignation that somehow irritated Morgan more than anger would have. "Son, I understand you're doing your job, but I designed the modifications on that submarine. I know her better than the blueprints." Morgan felt his jaw tighten. He'd heard variations of this story before. Retired veterans who thought their past service entitled them to override current security protocols. "Sir, with all due respect, the Tempest has been updated significantly since the 90s. Even if you did serve aboard her, current regulations require—" The radio on Morgan's belt crackled to life. "Lieutenant Morgan, this is Base Command. Admiral Thompson on the line for you. Urgent." Morgan unclipped the radio, his eyes never leaving Harris. "Morgan here, sir." Admiral Thompson's voice came through clear and unmistakable. "Lieutenant, there should be a Captain James Harris at your checkpoint. Let him aboard the Tempest immediately. Full access. That's a direct order." Morgan's certainty wavered for the first time. "Sir, his identification is—" "I don't care if he's carrying a library card, Lieutenant. Let Captain Harris aboard. He built her. I'll be there within the hour to check on him personally." The line went dead. Morgan stood there, radio in hand, feeling the first crack in his professional composure. He looked at Harris, who hadn't moved, hadn't smirked, hadn't done anything to suggest vindication. The old man simply waited. "My apologies, Captain," Morgan said, the words coming out stiffer than he intended. "I'll escort you to the Tempest personally." "Thank you, Lieutenant." Harris's tone held no triumph, only a quiet gratitude that made Morgan feel smaller than any reprimand could have. They walked through the security checkpoint in silence. Morgan signed Harris in, issued him a visitor badge, and led him down the main thoroughfare of the base. Around them, the morning watch was changing. Sailors in working uniforms moved with purpose between buildings. The distant sound of a bosun's whistle carried across the water. Morgan had always loved this time of day, the sense of order, of everything and everyone knowing their place and purpose. Harris walked beside him, not slowly but deliberately, taking in every detail. Morgan noticed the way the older man's eyes lingered on the new communications building, the updated barracks, the digital displays that had replaced the old manual systems. "Last time I was here," Harris said, breaking the silence, "that building was a parking lot." Morgan glanced at the structure in question, a massive operations center completed just 5 years ago. "Things change," he said, then immediately regretted how dismissive it sounded. "They do," Harris agreed. "Not always for the better, but they do." They turned down the road leading to the waterfront. Morgan could see the submarines berthed in their usual spots, the great gray hulls rising from the water like sleeping leviathans. The USS Tempest sat at Pier 7, exactly where Harris had said she would be. She was a Los Angeles-class fast-attack submarine, commissioned in 1985. Morgan had studied her specs during his training. She'd seen action in the Cold War, participated in countless classified missions, and was now in her final years of service. "There she is," Harris said softly, and Morgan heard something in his voice, reverence mixed with sorrow, like a man visiting an old friend who'd fallen ill. Morgan had been assigned to submarine duty for 3 years, but he'd never quite understood the way some officers talked about their boats. To him, a submarine was a machine, sophisticated, deadly, but ultimately just steel and electronics. Yet watching Harris's face as they approached the Tempest, Morgan saw something different. Whatever relationship this man had with the vessel, it ran deeper than machinery. "Beautiful, isn't she?" Harris said. Morgan looked at the Tempest with fresh eyes, trying to see what Harris saw. She was well maintained, her hull free of excessive rust, her lines clean and purposeful. But beautiful? That seemed like sentiment clouding judgment. "She's a solid boat, sir," Morgan offered. Harris smiled faintly. "You sound like my XO used to. All business, no poetry." He paused at the edge of the pier, one hand reaching out as if to touch the hull from a distance. "How long have you been in the Navy, Lieutenant?" 6 years, sir. 3 at this base." "Submarine qualified?" "Yes, sir. Completed my Dolphins 2 years ago." Morgan touched the silver insignia on his chest, the submarine warfare badge he'd earned through months of intensive study and practical examinations. "Good," Harris said. "Then you understand what it means to serve underwater. The pressure, the isolation, the absolute dependence on every man aboard doing his job perfectly." "I do, sir." Morgan felt defensive again, though he wasn't sure why. He'd passed every qualification, excelled in every assignment. His father had served on submarines. His grandfather, too. The Morgan family had 3 generations of submarine service, and Marcus intended to command his own boat someday. Harris seemed to sense his bristling. "I'm not questioning your qualifications, Lieutenant. I'm just remembering what it was like to be young and certain about everything." He started walking again, toward the gangway that led to the Tempest's deck. "I was about your age when I took command of her. Thought I knew everything worth knowing about submarine warfare." "And you didn't?" Morgan asked, following him onto the pier. Harris stopped at the base of the gangway, his hand finally touching the hull. The metal was cold under the gray autumn sky, but Harris's hand lingered there as if drawing warmth from it. "I knew the manuals. I knew the procedures. I knew the tactics." He looked directly at Morgan. "I didn't know the cost." Before Morgan could ask what he meant, Harris was climbing the gangway with surprising agility for a man who had to be in his late 60s. Morgan hurried after him, suddenly aware that he was supposed to be escorting this visitor, not following him around like a junior officer. On deck, a petty officer approached them. "Can I help you, sirs?" "Captain Harris is here on the Admiral's authority," Morgan said quickly, reasserting some control over the situation. "Full access." The petty officer's eyes widened slightly. "Captain Harris? Sir, are you the Harris from the emergency surfacing protocols?" Harris nodded slowly. "I am. It's an honor, sir. We study your procedures at submarine school. They're part of the core curriculum now." "I'm glad they're useful," Harris said, but Morgan noticed he didn't seem pleased by the recognition. If anything, he looked pained. "Would you like me to notify the boat's captain that you're here, sir?" the petty officer asked. "No need," Harris said. "I'm just here to walk through her one more time. The lieutenant will accompany me." The petty officer saluted and returned to his station. Harris turned to Morgan. "Shall we?" They descended into the submarine through the forward hatch. The smell hit Morgan immediately, that distinctive combination of oil, electrical equipment, and recycled air that every submarine carried. To him it smelled like work. But Harris inhaled deeply, as if savoring a fine wine. "Still smells the same," Harris murmured. "Different equipment, same essence." They moved through the forward compartment, past the torpedo room where several off-duty crew members were conducting maintenance. Harris paused to watch them work, his eyes tracking every movement with professional assessment. One of the younger sailors noticed them and straightened up. "Inspection, sir?" he asked Morgan nervously. "No, just a tour," Morgan assured him. "Carry on." Harris said nothing, but Morgan saw him nod approvingly at the sailor's technique with the torpedo tube mechanism. They continued aft, through the berthing areas where submariners slept in stacked racks so narrow they were called coffins by some. Harris ran his hand along the bulkhead, his fingers tracing rivets and seams. "I slept in rack 47 during my first patrol," Harris said, "before I made captain. Terrible bunk, right next to the hydraulic pump. Sounded like a washing machine all night." Morgan found himself relaxing slightly. These were the kinds of sea stories every veteran told, harmless reminiscences that hurt no one. "Where did you serve before taking command of the Tempest, sir?" "USS Dolphin, then the Philadelphia. Research boat and fast attack. Learned something different from each one." Harris stopped at an intersection of corridors. "Control room is this way, right?" "Yes, sir." Morgan was surprised Harris had to ask. If he'd commanded the boat, surely he'd know. But then Harris smiled. "Just checking if they'd rearranged anything." "They did that on the Philadelphia during a refit. Moved the whole damn wardroom to the other side of the boat. Spent a week walking into bulkheads before I adjusted." They entered the control room, the nerve center of the submarine. Here, beneath the surface, officers and crew would monitor every system, plot courses, track contacts, and make the decisions that kept the boat and her crew alive. Harris stood in the doorway for a long moment, his eyes moving across the updated digital displays, the modern sonar equipment, the computer systems that had replaced the analog controls he would have known. "This used to be all dials and switches," Harris said quietly. "We plotted courses by hand, calculated firing solutions with slide rules when the computers failed." He moved to the captain's chair, a simple elevated seat with a clear view of all stations. "May I?" Morgan hesitated. The captain's chair was traditionally sacred space, but the Admiral had said full access. "Of course, sir." Harris sat down slowly, his hands gripping the armrests with a familiarity that transcended the decades since he'd last occupied this position. His eyes closed briefly, and Morgan saw his lips move silently, as if in prayer or remembrance. When Harris opened his eyes again, they were bright with unshed tears. "I made the most important decision of my life in this chair," he said. "October 15th, 1989, 2:17 in the morning. Everything changed." Morgan felt the atmosphere shift. This wasn't nostalgia anymore. This was something deeper, something heavier. "Sir, what happened?" Harris looked at him for a long moment, as if weighing how much to say. "We were 847 feet down in the North Atlantic. Reactor cooling system failed. Fire in the engine room. Enemy destroyer directly overhead." His voice was steady, but his knuckles were white on the armrests. "I had 78 men aboard. 12 of them were trapped in the aft section when I gave the order to seal the bulkhead." Morgan's breath caught. He knew the basics of submarine emergency procedures. Compartmentalization could save the boat but doom anyone on the wrong side of a sealed hatch. But knowing the theory and hearing about it from someone who'd lived it were entirely different things. "I chose the many over the few," Harris continued. "I saved 66 men. I killed 12. He looked directly at Morgan. "Do you know what it means to give an order that kills your own men, Lieutenant?" Morgan couldn't answer. His mind raced through every training scenario, every emergency drill, every classroom discussion about command decisions. None of it had prepared him for the raw truth in Harris's voice. "No, sir," he finally said. "I don't. I hope you never do," Harris said softly. He stood up from the chair, suddenly looking every year of his age. "But if you're going to command submarines, you need to understand that someday you might have to, and you need to be ready for what that does to you." The control room felt smaller now, the air heavier. Morgan had expected a pleasant tour, an elderly veteran sharing harmless memories. Instead, he'd walked into something profound and painful, a reckoning that had been 35 years in the making. "Sir," Morgan said carefully, "is that why you're here?" "Because of what happened in 1989? Harris nodded. "Today is October 15th. I visit their families every year on this day. But this year, I wanted to come here first, to the boat, to the place where it all happened." He gestured around the control room, "to say goodbye. Goodbye to the Tempest, to the Tempest, to the memories, to the ghosts." Harris's voice was barely above a whisper. "I'm 71 years old, Lieutenant. This might be my last chance to walk these decks before I'm too old to make the journey. And I needed to do it one more time, to face what I did, to remember who they were, to try, finally, to find some peace." Morgan stood there, his clipboard forgotten, his protocols irrelevant. He was no longer escorting a visitor. He was witnessing something sacred and terrible, a man confronting the defining moment of his life in the exact place it had occurred. "Would you like to continue the tour, sir?" Morgan asked, his voice gentler than before. Harris nodded. "I would. There are a few places I need to see. A few things I need to say." He looked at Morgan with unexpected intensity. "And maybe, if you're willing to listen, a few things you need to hear." Morgan led Harris through the passageways of the USS Tempest, his mind still processing what the captain had revealed. 12 men dead, a choice made in this very submarine. The date, October 15th, suddenly carried weight it hadn't possessed an hour ago. They moved aft, deeper into the boat. Harris's hand trailed along the bulkhead, his fingers reading the metal like braille. Every rivet, every seam seemed to trigger a memory. Morgan noticed how Harris navigated without hesitation, turning at intersections before Morgan could indicate the direction, ducking under low overheads with practiced ease. The layout might have been updated, but the bones of the boat remained the same, and Harris's body remembered. "You move through here like you never left," Morgan observed. "Muscle memory," Harris said. 7 years aboard her. "You don't forget that." He paused at a junction. "The captain's quarters are this way, aren't they?" "Yes, sir. Though I'm not sure we should." The Admiral said full access. Harris's tone wasn't harsh, but it was firm. The voice of a man who'd commanded submarines and expected compliance. Morgan nodded and followed Harris to the captain's quarters. The door was closed but unlocked. Harris opened it and stepped inside. The space was small, barely larger than a walk-in closet, but it held the captain's bunk, a narrow desk, and a chair bolted to the floor. Personal photos were mounted on one bulkhead. The current captain's family, smiling faces that seemed incongruous in this steel tomb. Harris stood in the center of the room, turning slowly, taking it all in. Then he moved to the chair and sat down with a heavy sigh. His hands gripped the armrests, and Morgan saw them trembling slightly. "Are you all right, sir?" Morgan asked. Harris didn't answer immediately. When he spoke, his voice was distant, as if he were talking to someone Morgan couldn't see. "I sat in this chair for hours after it happened. Couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. Just sat here writing letters to families I didn't know how to face." Morgan remained by the door, uncertain whether to stay or leave, whether to speak or remain silent. He'd never been trained for this. How to handle a veteran working through trauma decades old. The inquiry board wanted a full report within 72 hours. Harris continued. "Standard procedure after casualties. They wanted facts, timelines, technical assessments. But how do you write a report that explains why 12 good men are dead? How do you reduce human lives to incident numbers and casualty statistics?" "I don't know, sir." Harris looked at him then, really looked at him, and Morgan felt the weight of that gaze. "You reminded me of myself this morning, Lieutenant. So certain, so sure of the rules and regulations, so confident that following protocol would always lead to the right outcome." He paused. "I was like that once, before I learned that sometimes every choice is wrong, and you simply have to pick which wrong you can live with." "What happened that night, sir?" "In detail, I mean." "If you're willing to share it." Harris studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "October 15th, 1989. We were tracking a Soviet submarine in the North Atlantic. Part of normal Cold War operations. We shadowed their boats. They shadowed ours. Intelligence had indicated this particular sub was carrying experimental missile systems, so we were ordered to maintain close contact and gather data." Morgan pulled the desk chair around and sat facing Harris, giving him his full attention. The operation was going smoothly. Harris continued. "We'd been trailing them for 6 days without incident. Then at 2:17 in the morning, everything went to hell. Alarm klaxons started screaming. The reactor cooling system had a catastrophic pump failure, a manufacturing defect we couldn't have predicted. Within minutes, we had a fire in the engine room." Harris's eyes lost focus, seeing something far beyond the small cabin. "I was in the control room. My XO, Commander Rodriguez, was in the engine room supervising a routine maintenance check. When the fire started, he immediately ordered evacuation and activated the suppression systems. But the fire spread faster than we'd trained for. The heat was melting through cables, causing secondary failures throughout the aft section. And the enemy destroyer?" Morgan prompted gently. "Soviet Udaloy-class destroyer. They'd been shadowing us just as we were shadowing the submarine. When our emergency started, they were directly overhead. We could hear their active sonar pinging off our hull. They knew exactly where we were. If we surfaced, we'd be captured or sunk. Either way, our mission would fail and our intelligence would be compromised." Harris's hands gripped the armrests tighter. Rodriguez was on the intercom. He was coordinating the firefighting efforts, keeping me informed of the situation. The fire was spreading toward the reactor compartment. If it breached the containment, we'd have a nuclear incident 800 feet down in international waters. Morgan felt his pulse quickening. He'd studied emergency procedures extensively. But Harris was describing a perfect storm of catastrophic failures. I had seconds to make a decision, Harris said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. The fire was out of control. We had men trapped in the aft section, Rodriguez and 11 others. The only way to save the boat was to seal the bulkhead between the engine room and the reactor compartment. But that meant sealing 12 men on the wrong side, Morgan finished. Harris nodded. Rodriguez knew it too. I could hear it in his voice when he reported the situation. He was giving me the information I needed to make the call he knew was coming. He was my best friend, Lieutenant. Served together for 8 years. I was godfather to his daughter, and I had to give the order that would kill him. The small cabin felt airless. Morgan wanted to say something, anything, but no words seemed adequate. I can still hear his voice on the intercom. Harris said, "Captain, fire is spreading to reactor access corridor. Recommendation, seal section 7 bulkhead." He was giving me permission, telling me it was okay, making it easier for me to do what had to be done. Harris's voice cracked. But it wasn't okay. It's never been okay. You saved the rest of the crew, Morgan said quietly. I killed 12 men. Harris looked directly at him. Both things are true, Lieutenant. I saved 66 and killed 12. The Navy gave me a commendation. The families gave me their hatred. I gave myself a burden I've carried every day for 35 years. Morgan sat back, processing the weight of what Harris had shared. What happened after you sealed the bulkhead? We executed an emergency blow in a debris field near the Soviet submarine. Created maximum chaos. Metallic debris everywhere, confusing their sonar. The destroyer started firing at phantom targets. In the confusion, we dove again and slipped away. The mission was technically a success. We gathered the intelligence we were sent to acquire. The Soviet submarine was monitored, their missile systems catalogued. Harris's laugh was bitter. We won, and it meant absolutely nothing measured against the cost. A young crew member appeared in the doorway, then stopped abruptly when he saw Harris and Morgan. "Sorry, sirs. Didn't know anyone was in here." "It's fine," Morgan said. "We'll be moving along shortly." The crew member hesitated, then said, "Sir, are you Captain Harris? The Harris who developed the emergency protocols?" Harris nodded wearily. "I am." The young man's face lit up. "Sir, it's an honor. We study your procedures at submarine school. They're brilliant. You've saved countless lives with those protocols." Harris's expression was unreadable. "Thank you, Petty Officer." "That's kind of you to say." The crew member saluted and left. Harris sat motionless, staring at the space where the young man had been. "Do you see the irony, Lieutenant?" Harris asked. "I created those protocols because of the men I lost. I spent 3 years working with naval engineers, redesigning emergency systems, developing new procedures. Everything I learned from that terrible night I turned into safeguards to prevent it from happening to others. That's admirable, sir. Is it? Or is it just me trying to convince myself that their deaths had meaning? That Rodriguez and Chen and O'Brien and Williams and the others died for something more than a Cold War intelligence operation nobody remembers anymore?" Harris stood, suddenly agitated. "I've spent 35 years trying to make their sacrifice matter, but I can't bring them back. I can't undo the order I gave. I can't give those families back the fathers and husbands and sons they lost." Morgan stood as well, uncertain how to respond to the raw emotion in Harris's voice. The confident young officer who'd started this morning so sure of himself felt woefully inadequate in the face of this man's pain. Harris took a deep breath, visibly trying to regain his composure. "I apologize, Lieutenant. I didn't come here to fall apart in front of you." "Sir, you have nothing to apologize for." Harris managed a weak smile. "You're kind, but I do. You're just doing your job, and I'm turning your ordinary Tuesday into a therapy session." He moved toward the door. "Let's continue. There are other places I need to see before I leave." Morgan followed him back into the corridor, but everything had changed. He was no longer escorting an old veteran on a sentimental tour. He was witnessing a man's pilgrimage to the site of his greatest trauma, a trauma that lived in the very metal and machinery around them. As they walked, Morgan found himself looking at the submarine differently. The bulkheads weren't just structural elements. They were the barriers that had sealed men to their fate. The intercom system wasn't just communication equipment. It was the last connection between a commander and the men he was condemning. The control room wasn't just the nerve center of the boat. It was the place where impossible decisions were made and carried forever. "Sir?" Morgan said as they reached the central passageway. Why did you come back? After all these years, why return to the boat? Harris stopped and turned to face him. Because I'm 71 years old and I don't have many years left. Because I wanted to stand in these spaces one more time while I still can. Because I needed to remember them here, where they died. Not just at their graves or in my nightmares. He paused. And because I wanted to see if coming back would finally let me let go. Has it? Harris looked around at the steel corridor, the overhead pipes, the cables running along the bulkheads. I don't know yet. Ask me when we're done. Morgan struggled to find words as they stood in the corridor. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the ambient hum of the submarine systems. Ventilation fans, electrical equipment, the subtle creaks of metal under stress. Sounds that had always been background noise to Morgan suddenly felt different, weighted with history and loss. I'm sorry, Morgan finally said, then immediately felt foolish. What good were apologies for events 3.5 decades past? But Harris looked at him with something like gratitude. Thank you, Lieutenant. You're the first person in uniform who said that to me in years. Most people don't know what to say when they hear the story, so they say nothing at all. May I ask you something, sir? Of course. You said Rodriguez was your best friend. How? Morgan paused, searching for the right words. How do you give an order like that to someone you care about? Harris leaned against the bulkhead, and for a moment he looked every one of his 71 years. You don't think of them as your friend in that moment. You can't. You have to think of them as a casualty report, a tactical consideration, a variable in an equation. Because if you think of them as human beings, as fathers and sons and friends, you'll hesitate, and hesitation in a crisis kills everyone. He pulled something from his jacket pocket, a tarnished silver pin in the shape of dolphins, the submarine warfare insignia. Rodriguez gave me this when I qualified for submarines. Said it would bring me luck. Harris turned it over in his weathered hands. I wore it for 7 years. Took it off the day after the incident and never put it back on. Couldn't bear to wear something he'd given me with such hope. Morgan felt his throat tighten. Did you ever talk to his family after? I attended the memorial service. All 12 services, actually. Stood in the back, watched widows and children cry, listened to chaplains talk about sacrifice and honor and duty. Harris's voice was hollow. Rodriguez's wife wouldn't look at me. His daughter was 6 years old. She kept asking her mother when Daddy was coming home. That must have been unbearable. It was necessary. They deserved to see me face what I'd done. I owed them that much. Harris pocketed the pin again. I wrote letters to each family. Tried to explain what happened, why their husbands and fathers died. Most of them never responded. A few wrote back, some forgiving, some filled with rage. Both reactions were justified. They began walking again, moving deeper into the submarine. Harris seemed to be following a specific path, though he didn't explain where they were going. Morgan simply followed, his role as escort now feeling more like witness. Can you tell me about the others? Morgan asked. The other 11 men? Harris nodded slowly, as if he'd been waiting for this question. Chen was the senior reactor technician. Brilliant mind, could diagnose problems before the instruments registered them. He had a wife and twin boys back in San Diego. The boys were 3 years old when he died. They passed through a hatch, Harris ducking automatically. O'Brien was 22, Irish Catholic, youngest of 7 kids. He wanted to make his family proud, prove he could be somebody. Wrote letters home every week without fail. His mother sent me one of them after the memorial service. He'd written about how honored he was to serve under my command. Morgan saw Harris's jaw clench. Williams was the cook. Best damn cook the Navy ever had on a submarine. Could make canned rations taste like a 5-star restaurant. He kept morale up during long patrols with his food and his terrible jokes. Engaged to be married that Christmas. As they walked, Harris continued naming the dead. Patterson, the sonar technician. Kowalski, the electrician. Martinez, the torpedo specialist. Each name came with a story, a detail, a human life reduced to memory. Do you remember all your crew members this well? Morgan asked. Or just the ones who died? I remember everyone who served under my command, Harris said. But yes, the dead are clearer. Their faces don't age. Their stories don't continue. They're frozen in time exactly as they were that night. They reached the torpedo room. Several sailors were running maintenance checks on the tubes. They glanced up as Harris and Morgan entered, but returned to their work after quick nods of acknowledgement. Harris ran his hand along one of the torpedo tubes, his touch almost reverent. These are new models. In my day, we had Mark 48s. Reliable weapons, but the targeting systems were temperamental. We still use Mark 48s, Morgan said. Just updated versions. Some things don't change, I suppose. Harris watched the sailors work with professional assessment. Your crew is well trained. I can see it in how they handle the equipment. One of the sailors, a petty officer whose name tape read Davis, approached them hesitantly. "Excuse me, sir. Lieutenant Morgan said you're Captain Harris?" "I am," Harris confirmed. Davis's face brightened with recognition. "Sir, I studied your emergency surfacing protocol at submarine school. It's part of the core curriculum now. You've probably saved more lives than anyone in submarine history with those procedures." Harris's expression flickered, something between pride and pain. "I appreciate you saying that, Petty Officer Davis. Could I ask you something, sir? About the protocol development?" "Of course. In the training materials, there's a section about balancing crew safety against mission objectives. The instructors always say it's the hardest calculation a commander makes. How did you approach that balance when you were developing the protocols?" Morgan saw Harris's hand tighten on the torpedo tube. The question was innocent, a young sailor eager to learn from a legend, but Morgan now understood the weight behind every word of Harris's response. "The balance," Harris said carefully, "is that there is no balance. Crew safety is the mission. If you lose your boat, you can't complete any objective. If you lose your crew, there's no one left to fight." He paused. "But sometimes you're faced with losing part of your crew to save the rest. And that's when you learn what command actually costs." Davis nodded earnestly, not fully grasping the depth of what Harris was saying. "That makes sense, sir." "Thank you." As Davis returned to his work, Harris turned to Morgan. "He has no idea what I'm talking about." "Not really. How could he? He's young, eager, well-trained. The scenarios are still theoretical to him." "They were theoretical to you once too," Morgan said. "They were. Right up until 2:17 in the morning on October 15th, 1989. Harris moved toward the exit. "And then theory became 12 body bags and 35 years of nightmares. They left the torpedo room and continued aft." Morgan found himself thinking about his own career, his own ambitions. He wanted to command a submarine someday, had always seen it as the pinnacle of naval service. But Harris was showing him a side of command he'd never fully considered. The weight of impossible choices, the burden of decisions that haunted you for decades. "Sir," Morgan said, "you mentioned wanting to command your own submarine. Do you still want that?" Morgan corrected himself. "I do, sir. It's what I've worked toward since joining the Navy." Harris stopped and looked at him with something like sympathy. "Then you need to understand something, Lieutenant. Command isn't about the authority or the prestige. It's about accepting that you'll have to make decisions no one should have to make, and then living with the consequences for the rest of your life. Is that why you're here? To warn me?" "No," Harris said quietly. "I'm here to remember them. But if my presence helps you understand what you're really aspiring to, then perhaps some good can come from this visit after all." They stood in the passageway, two men separated by decades and experience, yet connected by the same institution, the same service, the same steel vessel that had witnessed both glory and tragedy. "Where do we go now?" Morgan asked. Harris's expression grew heavier. "The engine room. I need to see where it happened, where I sealed the bulkhead, where they died." The walk to the engine room felt longer than it should have. Harris moved more slowly now, each step deliberate, as if approaching sacred ground. Morgan noticed the older man's breathing had changed, shorter, shallower, not from exertion, but from something deeper. "The layout has changed significantly back here," Morgan offered. "After your incident, they redesigned the entire aft section. New safety systems, redundant cooling, improved fire suppression." "I know," Harris said. "I helped design them." Morgan stopped. "You did?" "For 3 years after the incident, I worked with naval engineers at the Pentagon. Went over every detail of what happened, every failure point, every second of the crisis. Turned my worst experience into technical specifications and safety protocols." Harris paused at a junction. "It was the only way I could make sense of it. If their deaths led to changes that saved other crews, then maybe it meant something." They descended a ladder to the lower level. The engine room was modern, almost unrecognizable from what it would have been in 1989. Computer systems monitored every function. Automated sensors watched for the slightest anomaly. The cooling systems had triple redundancy. Harris stood at the entrance, taking it all in. "It's completely different. I barely recognize it. Is that better or worse?" Morgan asked. "I don't know." Harris stepped inside, moving to where the old reactor access corridor would have been. "The fire started here. Well, where here used to be. A coolant pump seized, metal on metal, generated enough heat to ignite hydraulic fluid in the adjacent line." He walked the space as if seeing through the modern equipment to the ghosts beneath. The flames spread along the cable runs. Rodriguez was supervising a routine maintenance check. Pure bad luck that he was down here at 2:17 in the morning. He could have been in his bunk. Morgan watched as Harris traced an invisible path through the compartment. The older man seemed to be walking through two realities simultaneously, the submarine as it was now, and the submarine as it had been on that terrible night. The temperature rose to over 800 degrees in less than 90 seconds. Harris continued, his voice taking on a detached clinical quality. The fire suppression systems activated, but the fire was too widespread. Rodriguez got 6 men out before the heat became unbearable. He went back for the others. He went back in? Morgan asked, surprised. Harris nodded. That's who Rodriguez was. XO doesn't stand just for executive officer. It stands for the person who executes the captain's orders, even when those orders mean certain death. His voice cracked slightly. He knew what I was going to do. He knew I'd seal the bulkhead, and he went back in anyway because those were his men too. Harris moved to where the bulkhead would have sealed. In the modern design, there were multiple hatches and escape routes. Lessons learned from 1989, but Harris seemed to see the old configuration, the single point of failure that became a death sentence. I could hear him on the intercom. Harris said, not screaming, not panicking, just reporting. Captain, fire is spreading to reactor access. 6 men evacuated. 6 still in compartment. Recommend immediate bulkhead seal. Harris's hands clenched. He gave me the recommendation. Made it an order from him, not just from me. Tried to take the weight off my shoulders, but it didn't work. Morgan said quietly, no, because I was the captain. The order was mine. The responsibility was mine. The guilt was mine. Harris turned to face Morgan. Do you know what I said to him? My last words to my best friend? Morgan shook his head. Acknowledged, Commander. Sealing bulkhead in 10 seconds. Get clear if you can. Harris's voice was barely audible. 10 seconds. I gave him 10 seconds to do the impossible. And then I gave the order, and the bulkhead sealed, and the intercom went silent. The modern engine room suddenly felt oppressive despite its spaciousness. Morgan could almost hear the alarms, smell the smoke, feel the heat that Harris was describing. How long did they survive after the bulkhead sealed? Morgan asked, then immediately regretted the question, but Harris answered. Between 4 and 7 minutes, according to the forensic analysis. The fire consumed the oxygen. They would have lost consciousness from smoke inhalation before. He stopped, unable to finish. Morgan pulled out a small notebook from his pocket. Something he'd written earlier that morning seemed relevant now. He flipped through pages until he found what he was looking for. Sir, I looked up the official incident report after the Admiral called. The Navy's investigation concluded your actions were exemplary. You saved the boat and 66 crew members. They cleared you of any wrongdoing. They cleared me, Harris repeated. The Navy cleared me. The inquiry board cleared me. Even some of the families eventually cleared me. He looked directly at Morgan. But I never cleared myself, Lieutenant. That's the burden no investigation can lift. From his jacket, Harris pulled out a sealed envelope yellowed with age. I wrote this letter 35 years ago. It's addressed to Rodriguez's daughter, Maria. She's 41 now, a doctor in Boston. I've watched her grow up from a distance, sent anonymous scholarship money, made sure she had opportunities, but I could never finish this letter. Could never find the words to tell her what happened to her father. Why not? Morgan asked gently. Because how do you tell a little girl that you killed her father? How do you explain that it was necessary, that it saved others, that it was the right call, when all she knows is that Daddy isn't coming home? Harris held the envelope like it might burn him. I've carried this for 35 years, rewritten it 100 times in my head. Never found the courage to send it. Morgan felt a wave of emotion he hadn't expected. Sir, have you ever considered that maybe she needs to hear from you? That knowing the truth might bring her closure too? Harris looked at the envelope for a long moment. Maybe, or maybe it would just reopen wounds that have finally healed. Maybe some things are better left unsaid. Or maybe, Morgan said carefully, some things need to be said before it's too late. Before Harris could respond, a voice called from the entrance. Captain Harris? Sir, I'm Petty Officer Chen. My father was Senior Reactor Technician David Chen. Both men turned. A young sailor in his early 30s stood in the doorway, his expression a mixture of nervousness and determination. Harris went pale. Your father, David Chen, was your father? The young man nodded. Yes, sir. I know what happened. My mother told me everything when I joined the Navy. She wanted me to understand the risks, the sacrifices. He stepped closer. Sir, I've wanted to meet you for years. To thank you. Thank me? Harris looked stricken. Son, I'm the reason your father died. No, sir, Chen said firmly. You're the reason 66 other men lived. You're the reason my mother received a pension and survivor benefits. You're the reason the Navy changed its protocol so other families wouldn't go through what we did." He paused. "My father was a good man, sir. He understood the risks. He chose to serve. And according to his last letter home, the one he wrote the day before the incident, he was proud to serve under your command." Harris seemed unable to speak. Morgan watched the older man's composure finally crack, tears streaming down his weathered face. Chen continued, "My mother wanted me to tell you, if I ever met you, that she forgave you years ago. She said you carried enough guilt for both of you and it was time to let it go. I can't." Harris struggled for words. Chen pulled out a small photo from his pocket. "This is my father holding me when I was 6 months old, a week before his last patrol. He looks happy, doesn't he?" Harris took the photo with trembling hands. He was happy. He loved being a father. "Talked about you constantly. Then honor his memory by letting yourself live, sir. That's what my mother told me to tell you." Chen straightened. "Permission to return to duty, sir?" "Granted," Harris whispered. Chen saluted and left. Harris stood holding the photograph, tears falling unchecked onto the image of a young father and his infant son. Morgan stepped closer but didn't touch him, giving Harris space to process this unexpected encounter. After a long moment, Harris carefully handed the photo back toward the doorway where Chen had gone, then realized the young man was already gone. "Keep it," came Chen's voice from the corridor. "My mother sent extras. She wanted you to have one." Harris clutched the photo to his chest and sank down to sit on the equipment box. Morgan finally moved to his side, sitting beside him in shared silence. They sat in silence for several minutes, Harris clutching the photograph of David Chen and his infant son. Morgan didn't push, didn't try to fill the quiet with meaningless words. Some moments demanded silence. Finally, Harris wiped his eyes and stood, carefully placing the photo in his jacket pocket next to the sealed letter. "I wasn't prepared for that," he said, his voice hoarse. "I've spent 35 years imagining what I'd say if I ever met the children of the men who died. Never imagined one of them would thank me." "Maybe you've been imagining the wrong conversation," Morgan suggested. Harris managed a weak smile. "Maybe." He looked around the engine room one more time as if committing it to memory. "Can we go somewhere else? I need to move." They left the engine room and made their way forward. Harris seemed lighter somehow, despite the emotional weight of the encounter. Morgan led them to the navigation station, a quiet corner of the boat where they could talk without interruption. "Sir, can I ask you something personal?" Morgan said as they settled near the navigation charts. "After what you've witnessed this morning, I don't think there's much you can't ask. Do you still have nightmares?" "About that night?" Harris nodded. "Less frequently now. In the early years, every night, I'd wake up hearing the alarms, smelling the smoke, hearing Rodriguez's voice on the intercom. My wife, ex-wife now, said I'd scream in my sleep." He paused. "That's part of why the marriage ended. She couldn't live with my ghosts and I couldn't let them go. I'm sorry. Don't be. She deserved better than a man who was only half present, the other half still trapped in October 1989. Harris pulled up a navigation chart on the digital display. "Can you show me the North Atlantic sector?" "Around 62 degrees north." Morgan entered the coordinates. The chart zoomed to show a section of ocean between Iceland and Greenland. "What are we looking for?" "This." Harris pointed to a specific coordinate. 62 degree N, 28 degree Au. That's where it happened. 847 feet down. October 15th, 1989. 2:17 in the morning. The precision was unsettling. Harris had memorized the exact location down to the minute and the foot. "You remember the exact depth?" "I remember everything about that moment, Lieutenant. The coordinates, the depth, the water temperature, the sonar readings, the pressure in the reactor, the names of every man on watch." Harris stared at the coordinates on the screen. "Some memories don't fade. They just become part of who you are." Morgan studied the chart. "Have you ever gone back there?" "To the site?" "No, I've thought about it. Looked into deep-sea diving expeditions, researched submarines that could take me down, but I was never sure what I'd be looking for." Harris zoomed the chart in closer. "The Navy surveyed the site in 1990, recovered some debris, documented the wreckage, filed it away as classified. I could access those files," Morgan said, "if you want to see them." Harris looked at him sharply. "You'd do that?" The Admiral said full access. "And after what you've shared with me today, I think you deserve to know what they found." Morgan pulled up his security terminal and entered his credentials. It took several minutes of searching through classified databases, but finally he found the file. Incident Review, USS Tempest, 15 OCT 1989, classified. "Here," Morgan said, turning the screen so Harris could see. Harris leaned forward, reading with intense focus. The report was technical, Dry. Navy bureaucracy at its most clinical. But embedded in the sterile language were details that made Harris's breath catch. They recovered personal effects, Harris said, his finger tracing down the screen. Rodriguez's wedding ring? Chen's pocket watch. O'Brien's cross. His voice broke. I didn't know. Nobody ever told me they'd recovered anything. Morgan scrolled further. According to this, the items are in Naval Archive storage at the Washington Navy Yard. They've been there for 35 years. Harris sat back, processing this information. All this time, pieces of them have been sitting in a warehouse somewhere, and nobody thought to tell the families. To tell me? The file was classified. Maybe they couldn't release the information without compromising the mission details. The mission, Harris said bitterly. Always the mission. Even dead, they're still classified, still serving, still secret. Morgan continued reading. Sir, there's more here. Intelligence assessments, tactical analysis. He stopped abruptly. What is it? Morgan's face had gone pale. The Soviet submarine you were tracking. According to this, it was carrying nuclear warheads, and it was experiencing its own catastrophic failure that night. Harris leaned forward again. What are you saying? The intelligence assessment says your decision to emergency surface in the debris field served a dual purpose. Yes, it confused the enemy destroyer. But it also positioned the Tempest to monitor the Soviet submarine's descent. They were worried about a potential nuclear incident on the ocean floor. Harris stared at the screen, his expression unreadable. I was briefed on the nuclear risk before the patrol. But I was told that information was classified at the highest levels. How is it in this file? This section was declassified 5 years ago, Morgan said, scrolling to the document header. Limited distribution, but it's no longer sealed. Harris read in silence, his jaw working. Finally, he spoke. So the 12 men who died, they didn't just die for an intelligence operation. They died buying time for Soviet rescue vessels to reach their submarine before a nuclear disaster occurred. According to this assessment, yes. And nobody told the families. Nobody told me. For 35 years, I thought they died for photographs of missile systems and sonar signatures. Harris's hands clenched into fists. They died preventing a potential nuclear catastrophe, and their sacrifice is still buried in classified files. Morgan didn't know what to say. The revelation had transformed the tragedy yet again, adding layers of significance that Harris had never known. The assessment concludes that your actions potentially prevented an environmental disaster that could have contaminated the North Atlantic for decades, Morgan read. The Soviet submarine was successfully rescued. No nuclear material was released. Mission accomplished. Harris stood abruptly, pacing the small space. 35 years. 35 years I've carried this weight, thinking their deaths were just another Cold War casualty. And now you're telling me there was more at stake? That the order I gave served a larger purpose? Does that make it easier? Morgan asked carefully. Harris stopped pacing. I don't know. It doesn't bring them back. It doesn't change the fact that I sealed that bulkhead. But, he paused, struggling for words. It adds context I never had. Meaning I couldn't see. The families still don't know, Morgan pointed out. The mission details are still classified, even if parts have been declassified for internal review. Harris sank back into his chair. So I can never tell them. Rodriguez's daughter can never know her father died for something more than Cold War espionage. Chen's son can never know his father helped prevent a nuclear disaster. The irony seemed to crush him. I finally learned the full truth and I still have to keep it secret. That's what command means, isn't it? Morgan said quietly. Carrying what no one else can carry. Knowing what no one else can know. Harris looked at him with something like respect. You're learning, Lieutenant. That's exactly what it means. He turned back to the screen, rereading the classified assessment. This changes nothing and everything. The order was still mine. The deaths are still on my conscience. But now I finally know, that they didn't die in vain. Morgan watched as Harris processed this revelation. The older man seemed to age and rejuvenate simultaneously, burdened by new knowledge, yet somehow relieved by it. Can you print this file? Harris asked. It's classified, sir. I know, but I need something. Some proof that what they did mattered more than I knew. Harris looked at Morgan with pleading eyes. Please, Morgan hesitated, then made a decision that probably violated a dozen regulations. He printed a single page, the executive summary that had been declassified. This is all I can give you, sir. And officially I never did. Harris took the page with trembling hands, folding it carefully and placing it in his pocket with the photograph and the unsealed letter. Thank you, Lieutenant. You've given me something I didn't know I needed. They sat together in front of the navigation display, the coordinates 62 to green. At the Grium W still glowing on the screen, a point in the ocean that held more weight than its simple geographic notation suggested, Harris sat motionless, staring at the coordinates on the screen. Morgan gave him space, understanding that the man was processing decades of guilt through the lens of new information. The quiet hum of the submarine systems filled the silence between them. "I need to see something else," Harris said finally. "Is there a record of commendations issued after the incident?" Morgan navigated through the files. "Yes, sir. Here, Navy Commendation Medal, authorized October 1989, awarded to Captain James R. Harris for—" He stopped reading. "For what?" Harris prompted. Morgan read the citation aloud. "For exceptional leadership and tactical decision-making under crisis conditions, resulting in the preservation of vessel and crew." He looked up. "Sir, this is a significant commendation." "Did you accept it?" "No," Harris said flatly. "I refused it. Told the Admiral who tried to present it that I wouldn't accept a medal for killing 12 men, no matter what the justification was." "What happened to the medal?" "It's in my personnel file somewhere. Never awarded, never presented, just noted as declined by recipient." Harris gestured to the screen. "Is it in there?" Morgan searched and found it. A scanned image of the actual medal, still in its presentation case, never removed. A small notation in the file read, "Capt. Harris declined. Personal reasons. 35 years in a file cabinet." Harris murmured, "They wanted to honor me for the worst day of my life. They wanted to recognize that you made an impossible choice and saved 66 lives." Morgan said, "That's not nothing, sir." "It's not everything either." Harris leaned back in his chair. "You asked earlier if I still have nightmares. Want to know what they're about?" Morgan nodded. "I dream I'm on the other side of the bulkhead. I can hear my own voice on the intercom giving the order to seal it. I understand finally. What Rodriguez felt in those last moments. The acceptance, the fear, the knowing that your captain is about to kill you and it's the right call." Harris's voice dropped to a whisper. "I dream of forgiving myself the way Rodriguez forgave me. But I wake up before I can say the words." A crew member passed by, glanced at them, then continued on. The normal operations of the submarine carried on around them, indifferent to the weight of the conversation happening in this small corner of the boat. "Sir, have you ever talked to anyone about this?" "Professional help, I mean. The Navy mandated therapy after the incident. 3 months of sessions with a psychiatrist who specialized in combat trauma. Nice man, tried his best, but he'd never commanded anything. Never had to choose who lives and who dies." Harris smiled without humor. "He kept asking me about anger, about denial, about the stages of grief. But I wasn't grieving. I was guilty." "That's different." "How is it different?" "Grief is passive. It happens to you. Guilt is active. You did something that caused the loss. Grief can heal with time. Guilt just becomes part of your foundation, the bedrock of who you are." Harris met Morgan's eyes. "Every decision I made for the rest of my career was filtered through October 15th, 1989. Every order I gave, every risk I calculated, every choice I faced, I measured it against that night." Morgan thought about his own career, his own ambitions. "Did it make you a better commander?" "It made me a more cautious one. Maybe too cautious. I second-guessed myself constantly, ran endless simulations in my head, always looking for the alternative I might have missed." Harris paused. "Admiral Thompson, he was my XO on a later command. He once told me I was thinking myself into paralysis, that I needed to trust my instincts again." "Did you trust your instincts again?" "Eventually, but it took years. And by then I was different. The man who commanded the Tempest died in that engine room with Rodriguez and the others. Someone else came out, someone who looked like me, wore my uniform, carried my name. But he wasn't the same person." Morgan absorbed this. "Is that why you're here? To see if you can find that person again? The one who existed before?" Harris considered the question. "No, that person is gone forever. I'm here to make peace with the person who replaced him. To accept that the cost of command includes losing parts of yourself you can never get back." A radio crackled nearby, normal communications chatter. Morgan listened with half an ear while Harris seemed lost in thought. Then Harris spoke again, his voice taking on a different quality. "I want to tell you something I've never told anyone. Not the therapist, not Thompson, not even my ex-wife." Morgan waited. "About a year after the incident, I planned my own death. Thought about it constantly, worked out all the details. I was going to make it look like an accident, a training exercise gone wrong, something that wouldn't deny my pension to my wife or shame my family." Harris's voice was steady, clinical. "I had it all planned. The timing, the method, the cover story. Morgan felt his chest tighten. What stopped you? Admiral Thompson. He figured it out somehow, saw something in my eyes or the way I was handling things. He called me into his office one day and closed the door. Told me, you don't get to choose the easy way out. Those men didn't get a choice. You don't get one either. Harris smiled sadly. Harsh words, but they saved my life. He made you stay, Morgan said. He made me understand that dying would be easier than living with what I'd done, and that taking the easy way would mean their deaths were for nothing. If I died, who would remember them? Who would carry their names? Who would make sure their sacrifice meant something? Harris looked at Morgan. So I stayed. And I've stayed. For 35 years I've stayed. Morgan felt tears prickling his own eyes. That takes more courage than I can imagine, sir. It doesn't feel like courage. It feels like penance. Like a debt I can never fully pay. Harris stood and moved to the periscope station. An old one, kept for backup, despite modern electronic systems. He gripped the handles. I used to stand here for hours during night watch, looking at nothing but ocean, thinking about everything and nothing at the same time. What did you think about? The weight of the boat above us. All that water, all that pressure. How fragile we were down there. How dependent on each system working perfectly. How one mistake could kill everyone. He released the handles. After the incident, I realized the real pressure wasn't the ocean. It was the responsibility. The knowledge that 78 lives depended on my judgment, my experience, my decisions. Morgan joined him at the periscope. And you carried that weight for how many more years? 15. Commanded 2 more boats after the Tempest, served as an instructor, mentored dozens of young officers. Every single day I thought about Rodriguez and Chen and O'Brien and the others. Every decision was made in their shadow. Did it get easier? No, but it became familiar. The weight didn't lighten, but I learned how to carry it better. Harris turned to face Morgan directly. That's what I want you to understand, Lieutenant. If you achieve your goal, if you command your own boat someday, you'll carry weight you can't imagine right now. And some of that weight will never leave you. Is it worth it? Morgan asked. Knowing the cost, would you do it again? Harris was quiet for a long moment. Yes, because for every day of guilt and nightmares, there were moments of purpose and meaning. 66 men went home to their families because of the call I made. Hundreds more have benefited from the safety protocols I developed. Every submarine that's avoided a similar disaster, that's Rodriguez's legacy. And Chen's, and all the others. He pulled the photograph from his pocket again, looking at David Chen and his infant son. That baby is now a petty officer serving on the boat where his father died. He thanked me for saving lives. That has to mean something, doesn't it? It means everything, sir, Morgan said quietly. Harris carefully returned the photo to his pocket. I have one more place I need to visit before I leave. The memorial plaque. They made their way to the officers' mess where a bronze memorial plaque hung on the forward bulkhead. Morgan had passed it hundreds of times, barely registering the names etched into the metal. Now, following Harris, he saw it differently. Each name a life, a story, a family left behind. Harris stood before the plaque, his weathered hand reaching out to trace the names. The list included crew members lost over the submarine's entire service history. But 12 names were clustered together, all dated October 15, 1989. LCDR Rodriguez, David M. John RT1 Chen, David W. John ET2 O'Brien, Patrick J. CS1 Williams, Marcus T. Harris read each name aloud. A ritual Morgan realized he'd probably performed countless times over the years. MM2 Patterson, Robert L., EM3 Kowalski, Stephen P., TM2 Martinez, Carlos R. He continued through all 12 names, his voice steady despite the tears streaming down his face. When he finished, he stood in silence, head bowed. Morgan waited, feeling like an intruder on a sacred moment. But then Harris spoke, his words clearly meant for Morgan to hear. I've read these names every October 15th for 35 years, at their graves, at the Naval Cemetery, in my nightmares. But standing here, on the boat where they died, it feels different, more final. He turned to Morgan. This is goodbye. Not just for today, but forever. I won't be back. Why not, sir? I'm 71. The trip is getting harder. My health isn't what it was. Harris smiled sadly. And maybe it's time to let them rest. To let myself rest? Before Morgan could respond, his radio crackled. Lieutenant Morgan, you have a visitor at the security checkpoint. Says it's urgent. Morgan frowned. Who is it? Admiral Thompson, sir. He's asking for Captain Harris. Harris's expression shifted, surprise mixed with something else. Tom came. I didn't think he would. Should we head up? Morgan asked in a moment. I need... Harris stopped, his attention caught by something. Lieutenant, could you give me a few minutes alone here? Please, Morgan hesitated, then nodded. Of course, sir. I'll meet you topside. He left Harris standing before the memorial plaque and made his way to the forward hatch. As he climbed the ladder, he heard Harris's voice, quiet but distinct, speaking to the names on the wall. On deck, Morgan found Admiral Thompson waiting, a distinguished man in his late 60s with steel-gray hair and the bearing of someone who'd spent a lifetime at sea. He saluted as Morgan approached. Lieutenant Morgan. Where's Jim? Below, sir. At the memorial plaque. He asked for a few minutes alone. Thompson nodded knowingly. He does that. Needs time to talk to them. He looked at the submarine with an expression Morgan couldn't quite read. How's he doing, really? Morgan considered the question carefully. It's been emotional, sir. He's shared things I don't think he's told many people. About the incident, the guilt, everything. Good. That's why I sent him to you. Morgan blinked. Sir, Thompson smiled. You think it was coincidence that Jim showed up at your checkpoint this morning? I called him last week, told him you'd be on duty today, told him you were a good officer who needed to understand what command really means. I don't understand. You're talented, Morgan. Top of your class, excellent reviews, clear command potential. But you're also rigid. Everything by the book, no room for the human element. Thompson's expression grew serious. I recommended you for submarine command school. But before you go, I wanted you to meet someone who could teach you what they don't cover in manuals. Morgan felt his understanding of the morning's events shift. You set this up. All of it. I suggested Jim visit the Tempest on the anniversary. I suggested he do it when you were on duty. The rest, the conversation, the connection, that was genuine. Thompson looked toward the hatch. Jim needs to tell his story. You need to hear it. 2 birds, 1 stone. Does Captain Harris know you manipulated this? Manipulated is a strong word. I facilitated. And yes, he knows. We discussed it. Thompson's voice softened. Jim's running out of time, Lieutenant. Not just because of age, but because he's carried this weight alone for too long. He needs to pass it on, to make sure someone from your generation understands what he went through and why it matters. Morgan processed this information, feeling manipulated, yet also strangely honored. Why me specifically? Because you remind us both of who we were before we learned the hard lessons. Confident, certain, maybe a little arrogant. Jim saw himself in you the moment he met you. Thompson paused. And because I believe you have the capacity to become a great commander, if you learn that greatness in command isn't about being right, it's about making peace with being wrong. Before Morgan could respond, Harris emerged from the hatch, moving slowly. His face was red from crying, but his expression seemed lighter somehow. Tom, Harris said, grasping Thompson's hand firmly. You came. Wouldn't miss it. This is your last visit. Had to be here. Thompson studied his old friend. How are you holding up? Better than I expected. Worse than I hoped. Harris glanced at Morgan. The lieutenant has been very patient with an old man's ghosts. He's learning, Thompson said. Aren't you, Morgan? Yes, sir. More than I expected to learn today. Thompson pulled a folder from his jacket. Jim, there's something you need to see. It arrived at my office yesterday. I was going to call you, but then I realized you'd be here today, so I brought it myself. Harris took the folder with curious eyes. What is it? Open it, Harris did. Inside was a formal Navy document, several pages thick. Morgan watched as Harris read, his expression moving through confusion, shock, and finally something that looked like anguish. When was this declassified? Harris asked, his voice tight. 5 years ago. Limited distribution. I only found out about it 6 months ago when I was reviewing historical mission files. Thompson's voice was gentle. I wanted to tell you in person. Morgan saw Harris's hands shaking as he held the document. Lieutenant, remember that classified file you showed me? About the nuclear risk? Yes, sir. Harris held up the document. This is the full mission briefing. The complete picture of what we were doing that night. He looked at Thompson. Why didn't anyone tell me? Why did I have to wait 35 years to learn the whole truth? Thompson sighed heavily. Because it was classified at the highest levels. Above top secret. Only a handful of people knew the full scope of the mission, and most of them are dead now. The file was buried, forgotten. When I found it, I knew I had to show you. Harris read aloud from the document, his voice hollow. Primary objective, monitor Soviet submarine K-2-1 during catastrophic failure event. Secondary objective, prevent nuclear material dispersal in event of uncontrolled descent. Tertiary objective, maintain cover as routine surveillance operation. He looked up. K-2-19. I didn't know they had a designation. I didn't know it had a name. There's more, Thompson said quietly. Keep reading. Harris flipped pages, then stopped. Morgan saw the blood drain from his face.
No, this can't be right. What is it?
Morgan asked. Harris read in a stunned whisper. Soviet submarine K-2-19 was carrying 6 RSM-25 nuclear missiles. Estimated warhead yield 3 megatons. Risk assessment concluded that uncontrolled descent and hull breach would result in... He couldn't continue. Thompson finished for him. Dispersal of nuclear material across approximately 2,000 square miles of ocean floor. Potential contamination of North Atlantic fisheries for decades. Estimated long-term casualties from contaminated food supply, between 50,000 and 200,000 people. The deck seemed to tilt beneath Morgan's feet. Captain Harris's actions prevented a nuclear catastrophe that would have made Chernobyl look small by comparison. Thompson said, the 12 men who died bought time for Soviet rescue vessels to reach K-2-19 before the hull breached. Their sacrifice saved tens of thousands of lives, maybe hundreds of thousands. Harris sank onto a deck box, the document falling from his hands. Why didn't anyone tell me? Why did I spend 35 years thinking they died for sonar readings and photographs? Because the mission was so classified that even the incident investigation couldn't include the full context. The inquiry board knew you'd made the right call, but they couldn't tell you why it was even more right than you knew. Thompson sat beside his old friend. I'm sorry, Jim. You deserved to know this decades ago. Rodriguez died preventing a nuclear disaster, and I couldn't even tell his family. Chen, O'Brien, all of them. They're heroes on a scale I never imagined, and it's still classified. Harris's voice broke. How is that fair? It's not fair, Thompson said simply. Nothing about this has ever been fair. Morgan picked up the document, scanning the pages. Sir, this briefing, it says Captain Harris was fully informed of the nuclear risk before the mission began, that he volunteered for the assignment knowing the stakes. Harris nodded slowly. I knew about the nuclear risk, but I didn't know the full scope, the potential casualties, the long-term contamination. They told me it was serious, but they didn't tell me it could kill hundreds of thousands of people over decades. Would it have changed your decision? Thompson asked. If you'd known the full scope? No, Harris said immediately. I still would have sealed the bulkhead, but I would have understood better why it had to be done. Why 12 lives were... He stopped, struggling. I was going to say worth it, but no lives are worth it. They just became necessary. Thompson stood and placed a hand on Harris's shoulder. Jim, this document has a final section. An addendum added just before declassification. You should read it. Harris picked up the document again, flipping to the last page. He read silently, and Morgan watched emotions play across the older man's face. Surprise, pain, and finally something that might have been peace. What does it say? Morgan asked. Harris read aloud, his voice thick with emotion. Final assessment. Captain James R. Harris's tactical decisions on October 15, 1989, represent the highest standards of naval command. His actions under extreme duress prevented a nuclear incident of catastrophic proportions. The loss of 12 crew members, while tragic, represents an acceptable casualty ratio, given the lives saved both immediately and in the long term. Captain Harris's subsequent refusal of commendation demonstrates the burden of command and the personal cost of tactical success. His contributions to submarine safety protocols ensure that his crew's sacrifice continues to save lives. Classification. Declassified as of 2019. Recommended reading for all submarine commanders. Harris lowered the document. They made it required reading? For submarine command school, yes. Thompson confirmed. Your story, not your name, but the incident, is taught as a case study in impossible choices and moral courage. Hundreds of officers have learned from what you went through. Morgan felt the weight of this revelation settling over them. Sir, doesn't this change everything? You've spent 35 years carrying guilt for a decision that saved hundreds of thousands of lives. Doesn't that absolve you? Harris looked at him with eyes that had seen too much. Does it absolve me with Rodriguez's daughter? With Chen's son? With the families who've spent 35 years without their loved ones? He shook his head. The scope of what was prevented doesn't erase what was lost. It just adds context. Terrible, overwhelming context. The three men stood on the deck of the USS Tempest, the autumn wind picking up around them. Morgan watched as Harris held the declassified document, his hands no longer shaking but gripping the papers with fierce intensity. There's something else you need to know, Thompson said, his voice carrying the weight of another revelation. Something I discovered in those same files. Harris looked up. What more could there possibly be, Tom? Thompson pulled out another document, this one smaller, a single page in a protective sleeve, the personal effects recovered from the wreckage. I had them pulled from the Naval archives. They're being transported here as we speak. Should arrive within the hour. Harris's face went pale. You brought them here, why? Because you've carried their memory for 35 years. I thought you might want to carry something tangible, something real. Thompson's expression was gentle but firm. And because one of those items contains something you need to see. What do you mean? You'll understand when you see it. But Jim. Thompson paused, choosing his words carefully. I want you to prepare yourself. What you're about to see might change everything. Morgan watched this exchange with growing concern. Harris already looked emotionally wrung out, and Thompson was suggesting another blow was coming. Can you tell me what it is? Harris asked. I could, but it will mean more if you see it yourself. Thompson checked his watch. We have about 45 minutes. Why don't we go somewhere more comfortable? The Admiral's conference room is available. Harris nodded slowly, and the three men made their way off the submarine. As they walked across the pier, Morgan noticed Harris moving more slowly than before, as if the weight of new knowledge had physical mass. They entered the base's administrative building and climbed to the second floor. The Admiral's conference room was spacious, with a long table and windows overlooking the harbor. Thompson gestured for them to sit. Jim, before the effects arrive, I want to talk about what happens next, Thompson said. You've spent your whole visit, your whole 35 years, looking backward. It's time to look forward. Forward to what? I'm 71, Tom. Most of my life is behind me. That's not true, and you know it. You could have another 20 years. The question is what you do with them. Thompson leaned forward. You've been visiting the families every October 15th for 3.5 decades. You've carried their grief alongside your own. But you've never let yourself live fully. You've been in purgatory. I don't deserve to live fully. Not when they can't. That's exactly the thinking I'm trying to challenge. Thompson's voice grew sharper. Rodriguez, Chen, O'Brien, all of them chose to serve. They knew the risks. They accepted them. And if they could speak to you now, do you think they'd want you to spend the rest of your life in self-imposed prison? Harris was silent. Morgan found himself speaking up. Sir, Petty Officer Chen told you his mother forgave you years ago. She said you'd carried enough guilt for both of you. What if all the families feel that way? They don't, Harris said quietly. Some of them still blame me. I get letters sometimes, even now. Angry letters from siblings, from children who've grown up without fathers. And how many forgiving letters do you get? Thompson asked. Harris paused. More than the angry ones, if I'm honest. Then maybe it's time to forgive yourself. Thompson stood and moved to the window. Jim, I'm retiring next year. I've been in the Navy for 43 years, and I'm ready to let it go. But I can't retire in peace if I know you're still torturing yourself over a decision that saved hundreds of thousands of lives. This isn't about you, Tom. No, it's not. It's about you. But you're my friend, and I'm tired of watching you suffer. Thompson turned back to face him. The personal effects that are being delivered, one of them is going to force you to confront something you've been avoiding. And I need you to promise me that you'll really look at it, really consider what it means. Before Harris could respond, there was a knock on the door. A young ensign entered carrying a sealed container. Official seals intact. Admiral Thompson, the materials you requested from Naval Archives. Thank you, Ensign. Set them on the table. The ensign placed the container carefully on the conference table and left. The three men stared at it. A simple gray box marked with security tape and classification stamps. 35 years in storage, Harris said, his voice barely audible. 35 years and they never told me. Thompson broke the seals and opened the container. Inside were several smaller boxes, each labeled with a name. He removed them one by one, placing them on the table. Rodriguez, David M. Chen, David W. O'Brien, Patrick J. Thompson arranged them carefully, treating each with reverence. Harris reached for Rodriguez's box with trembling hands. Thompson placed a hand on his wrist. Wait, before you open any of them, I need to tell you something. When the effects were recovered and cataloged, they found more than just personal items. They found something Rodriguez wrote. In the final minutes before, he paused. Before the end, Harris's breathing became shallow. What do you mean, wrote? Submarines carry emergency paper in sealed compartments for exactly this kind of situation. When the fire started and it became clear what was happening, Rodriguez wrote something. It was recovered with his wedding ring. Morgan felt tears burning in his eyes, and he wasn't even directly involved in the story. He could only imagine what Harris was feeling. Thompson opened Rodriguez's box and removed the wedding ring, a simple gold band, tarnished but intact. Beside it was a piece of paper in a protective plastic sleeve. The edges were burned, the paper discolored by heat and smoke, but the writing was legible. Do you want me to read it first? Thompson asked gently. Or do you want to read it yourself? Harris extended his hand, and Thompson gave him the protected document. Harris held it up to the light, and Morgan could see writing in black ink, slightly smudged but clear enough to read. Harris's voice broke as he began reading aloud. Jim, if you're reading this, it means you made the call. You gave the order. You saved the boat. You saved the mission. He stopped, unable to continue. Thompson picked up where he left off, reading from memory. He'd clearly read this before. I want you to know I understand. You saved the others. You saved the mission. You did what you had to do. Don't carry me as a weight. I volunteered for this life. I knew the risks. Tell my daughter I loved her. Tell my wife I'm sorry I won't see her grow old. Tell yourself you did what you had to do. Harris was openly weeping now, the paper shaking in his hands. Thompson continued reading the final lines. Your friend, even now, even here, even at the end. Don't let this destroy you, Jim. Live for both of us. That's an order from your XO, Rodriguez. The room was silent except for Harris's ragged breathing. Morgan sat frozen, witnessing the most profound moment of grief and grace he'd ever seen. He forgave you, Thompson said quietly. In his final moments, knowing he was about to die, he took the time to write you forgiveness, to order you to live. Harris clutched the document to his chest. I never knew. 35 years, and I never knew he understood. He more than understood. He approved. He ordered you to let it go and live. Thompson moved around the table and placed both hands on Harris's shoulders. So, the question is, are you going to follow your XO's final order? Harris looked up at him, face wet with tears. How? How do I just let go of 35 years of guilt? You don't let go all at once. You start. You take the first step. Thompson glanced at Morgan. You tell Rodriguez's daughter about this letter. You give her father's ring and his final words. You let her see that her father died understanding the necessity of what happened. She's a doctor in Boston, Harris said. I've kept track of her, helped when I could, but I've never approached her directly. I wouldn't know what to say. You say what Rodriguez said, that her father understood, that he forgave, that he wanted you to live. Thompson returned to his seat, and you give her the other thing you've been carrying. Harris reached into his jacket and pulled out the sealed letter. I wrote this 35 years ago. It's outdated, irrelevant. It's a piece of her father's story. And yours. She deserves to have it. Thompson's voice was firm. Jim, you came here today to say goodbye to the Tempest, to the memories, to the ghosts. But you can't fully say goodbye until you complete what you started. Give Maria Rodriguez her father's ring, his final letter, and your letter. Close that circle. Morgan watched as Harris considered this, saw the decades of resistance warring with the need for closure. Finally, Harris nodded. I'll do it. I'll contact her. This week before I lose my courage. Good. Thompson opened the other boxes, revealing Chen's pocket watch, O'Brien's cross, and other recovered items. These belong to the families too. Would you like help contacting them? Yes, I think I would. Harris looked at each item, his expression transforming from grief to something resembling acceptance. They all deserve to know their loved ones' final moments meant something, that their sacrifices prevented catastrophe. Most of that is still classified, Thompson reminded him. You can't tell them about the nuclear risk or the lives saved. Then I'll tell them their loved ones died with honor, serving with distinction, remembered with respect. Harris's voice grew stronger. And I'll tell them their captain never forgot them, never stopped honoring their service, never stopped working to make sure their deaths had meaning. Thompson smiled. Now you're talking like a commander again. Morgan had been quiet throughout this exchange, but now he spoke up. Sir, there's something else Captain Harris should know. About the submarine. Both older men looked at him. What is it, Lieutenant? Thompson asked. Morgan pulled out a document he'd retrieved earlier. The USS Tempest is being decommissioned in 6 months. She'll be retired from active service. Harris absorbed this information with a nod. I suppose it's time. She's served well, carried her crews faithfully. She deserves to rest. There's talk of making her a museum, Morgan added, preserving her history including the 1989 incident. A museum? Harris looked at Thompson. Is that confirmed? Nothing's confirmed yet, but there's support for it. If it happens, your story, the full story that can be declassified, would be part of the exhibit. Thompson paused. How would you feel about that? Harris considered. I'd want the 12 names honored. Not hidden, not footnoted, but central to the story. They're the real heroes. I just made the call. You made the impossible call, Thompson corrected. And you lived with the consequences. That takes a different kind of heroism. Harris stood and walked to the window, looking out at the submarine berthed at the pier. She looks good for her age. Almost 40 years of service. That's a lifetime. It is, Thompson agreed. For both of you. Harris turned back to face them. When I walked onto this base this morning, I thought I was coming to say goodbye. To make peace with the past and close a chapter. He looked at the personal effects spread across the table. But maybe I'm not saying goodbye. Maybe I'm finally saying hello to whatever comes next. Morgan felt a swell of emotion. This morning he'd been a by-the-book officer annoyed at an old man's presumption. Now he was witnessing a transformation he'd carry with him for the rest of his career. There's one more thing I think you should do, Thompson said, before you leave the base today. What's that? Go back to the control room. Sit in the captain's chair one more time. But this time, instead of remembering what you lost, remember what you saved. 66 men who went home to their families. Hundreds of thousands who never knew they were in danger. Decades of submariners who've served safely because of the protocols you developed. Thompson's voice was gentle but insistent. Remember the whole story, not just the tragedy. Harris nodded slowly. Will you both come with me? I don't think I can do it alone. Of course, Thompson said. It would be an honor. Sir, Morgan added. The three men stood together, preparing for one final visit to the heart of the submarine, this time not to confront ghosts, but to honor them and finally, perhaps, to let them rest. They walked together back to the submarine. Three men bound by different relationships to the same vessel. Thompson led the way with the confidence of an admiral who'd spent decades commanding respect. Morgan followed, still processing everything he'd witnessed, and Harris walked between them, carrying Rodriguez's letter carefully in his jacket pocket alongside the photograph and his own unsealed letter. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the pier. The USS Tempest sat quiet and still in her berth, unaware that one of her former commanders was about to face his final reckoning with her. As they boarded, several crew members stopped their work to watch. Word had spread through the boat about Captain Harris's visit, about who he was and what he'd done. Young sailors who'd studied his protocols in school now saw the man himself, older, weathered, but still carrying himself with the dignity of command. Petty Officer Davis approached and saluted. Sir, the control room has been cleared for you. The captain sends his respects and says you're welcome to take all the time you need. Thank you, Harris said, his voice steady. Please express my gratitude to your captain. They descended into the submarine for what Harris knew would be his final time. The familiar smell of oil and recycled air surrounded him. The sound of his footsteps on the metal deck echoed through the passageways. Everything was simultaneously familiar and foreign. The bones of the boat, he remembered, dressed in the flesh of modern technology. When they reached the control room, Harris paused at the entrance. Morgan saw him close his eyes, take a deep breath, and then step across the threshold. The space was empty as promised, all stations unmanned, screens glowing softly in standby mode. The captain's chair sat in its elevated position, waiting. Harris walked a slow circuit of the control room, his hands trailing over consoles, his eyes taking in every detail. He stopped at the sonar station where his operator would have called out contacts. He moved to the weapons control where firing solutions would have been calculated. He paused at the communications station where Rodriguez's final words had come through. October 15th, 1989, 2:17 a.m. Harris said quietly, I was standing right here when the alarms started. I can still hear them. That particular pitch and rhythm that means catastrophic failure. Thompson and Morgan remained near the entrance, giving him space. The reactor officer called from the engine room. Captain, we have a major casualty. Coolant pump is seized. Temperature rising rapidly. Textbook calm, professional, but I could hear the fear underneath. Harris moved to the captain's chair but didn't sit yet. His hand rested on the armrest, fingers curling around the worn material. Rodriguez was supposed to be sleeping. His watch didn't start for another 2 hours. But he heard the alarm and went directly to the engine room because that's who he was. Always where he was needed most. Harris finally sat down, his body settling into the chair with remembered familiarity. His hands gripped the armrests and Morgan saw his knuckles whiten. The reports came fast after that. Fire in the hydraulic line, spreading to the cable runs. 6 men evacuated, temperature at 600 degrees and climbing. Smoke filling the compartment. Harris's eyes were distant, seeing that night instead of this afternoon. And overhead, the destroyer. Active sonar pinging off our hull every 30 seconds. They knew exactly where we were. You had no good options, Thompson said quietly from the doorway. No. Every choice led to death. Surface and get captured or sunk. All 78 lost. Stay down with the fire raging. All 78 lost. Emergency blow and hope the confusion covered us. Maybe 66 saved. Definitely 12 lost. Harris looked at his hands. Mathematics of death. That's what command becomes in crisis. He lifted his head and looked at the communications panel. Rodriguez's voice was so calm when he made his final report.
Captain, fire is spreading to reactor access corridor.
6 men still in compartment. I'm attempting evacuation, but... And then he paused. Just 1 second. But in that second, I heard him understand. He knew what I was going to do. He gave you permission, Thompson said. He did. He said recommend immediate bulkhead seal. I'll get as many out as I can, but you need to seal it now, Jim. Right now. Harris's voice cracked on the name. He called me Jim. Not Captain, not Sir. Jim. My friend was saying goodbye. Morgan felt tears running down his own face, unable to stop them. I gave the order, Harris continued. 10 seconds to seal. I counted them down in my head while I listened to Rodriguez. Trying to save men who couldn't be saved. 10, 9, 8. I could hear him shouting for them to move faster. 7, 6, 5. The smoke was so thick his voice was getting weaker. 4, 3, 2. He stopped shouting. 1. I gave the command. The bulkhead sealed. Harris closed his eyes and tears streamed down his weathered face. And then silence. Absolute silence from the aft compartment. Just the sound of the fire on the other side of the bulkhead, consuming everything. Consuming them. The control room was absolutely still. Thompson had moved to stand beside the captain's chair, his hand on Harris's shoulder. Morgan stood transfixed, witnessing the full weight of a decision made 35 years ago. But we survived. Harris said, opening his eyes. We executed the emergency blow. The destroyer fired at shadows in the debris field. We slipped away. The Soviet submarine was rescued. No nuclear material was released. The mission succeeded. He looked up at Thompson. And I've spent 35 years wondering if success was worth the price. Thompson's grip on Harris's shoulder tightened. Jim, I need you to do something for me. I need you to finish the story. Not the way you've been telling it for 35 years, but the whole story. The part you learned today? Harris looked up at him, confused. What do you mean? Tell Lieutenant Morgan what happened because of your decision. Tell him about the hundreds of thousands of lives that weren't contaminated by nuclear material. Tell him about the submarine protocols that have saved dozens of crews since then. Tell him about Petty Officer Chen, who serves on this boat because his father's death had meaning. Thompson's voice was firm but kind. Tell the whole truth, not just the tragedy. Harris sat silent for a long moment, his hands still gripping the armrests. When he spoke, his voice was different, stronger, more centered. After we surfaced and escaped, after the adrenaline faded and the immediate crisis passed, I had to write the incident report. Standard procedure, timeline, decisions made, casualties sustained. He looked at Morgan. I wrote it 3 times. The first version was just facts, no context. The second version was full of self-recrimination and guilt. Admiral Thompson, he was Commander Thompson then. He read both and threw them away. Thompson nodded. I told him to write it a 3rd time. To write it as if Rodriguez was reading over his shoulder. To write it in a way that honored the sacrifice instead of drowning in the guilt. So I did, Harris continued. I wrote about 12 men who stayed at their posts during a crisis, who followed orders even when those orders meant certain death, who trusted their captain to make the impossible choice. I wrote about courage and duty and sacrifice. He paused. And I wrote about 66 men who went home because 12 didn't. Harris pulled Rodriguez's letter from his pocket, holding it carefully. For 35 years, I thought Rodriguez died cursing my name. I thought they all did. 12 men watching the bulkhead seal, knowing their captain had abandoned them. But he didn't curse me. He understood. He forgave. He ordered me to live. And are you going to follow that order? Thompson asked. Harris looked around the control room, seeing it with new eyes. This room has seen thousands of decisions. Some easy, most routine, a few impossible. But every one of them was made by someone trying to do the right thing with incomplete information and limited time. He stood up from the captain's chair. I made the best decision I could with what I knew. And today I learned it was even more important than I realized. He turned to Morgan. Lieutenant, when you get your command, and you will, you'll sit in a chair like this one. And someday maybe you'll face an impossible choice. When that happens, I want you to remember something. What's that, sir? Morgan asked. Remember that command isn't about being fearless. It's about acting despite fear. It's not about having all the answers. It's about making the best decision you can and then living with the consequences. Harris's voice grew stronger with each word. And it's not about carrying guilt forever. It's about honoring those who trusted you enough to follow your orders, even into death. Harris moved to the communications panel, the last place Rodriguez's voice had come through. He placed his hand on it gently. I forgive you for dying, old friend, and I'm finally going to try to forgive myself for living. Thompson stepped forward. There's one more thing, Jim. Something I arranged that you don't know about yet. Harris turned. What now, Tom? I don't think my heart can take many more surprises. This one is good, I promise. Thompson pulled out his phone and made a call. Send her in. Harris looked confused. Send who? The door to the control room opened, and a woman in her early 40s stepped through. She had dark hair and kind eyes, and she was carrying a small girl of about 5 years old. Behind them stood Petty Officer Chen. Harris went pale. Maria Rodriguez? The woman nodded, tears already streaming down her face. Hello, Captain Harris. It's been a long time. Harris seemed unable to move, rooted to the spot. I don't understand. How are you here? Admiral Thompson called me yesterday. Told me you'd be visiting the Tempest today. Told me it was time we finally talked. Maria set her daughter down and stepped closer. I've wanted to meet you for 35 years, but I didn't know how to find you. And I think maybe you didn't know how to face me. I didn't. Harris admitted, his voice breaking. I killed your father. How could I face you? You didn't kill him, Maria said firmly. You commanded him. There's a difference. He chose to serve. He chose to go into that engine room. He chose to stay and try to save others. She pulled out a folded piece of paper from her purse. My mother gave me this before she died. It's a letter my father wrote to me before his last patrol. She unfolded it and read, Dear Maria, if you're reading this, it means I didn't come home. I want you to know I died doing what I loved, serving with the best crew and the best captain in the Navy. Captain Harris is a good man, sweetheart. If anything happens to me, I want you to know it wasn't his fault. He'll blame himself. That's the kind of man he is. But you tell him, when you're old enough to understand, that I trusted him with my life, and that trust was well placed. Love always, Dad. Harris collapsed back into the captain's chair, overwhelmed. Maria knelt beside him, taking his weathered hands in hers. I've carried my father's forgiveness for you my entire adult life, she said. I became a doctor because of him, because he died saving others, and I wanted to save others too. His death gave my life purpose and direction. So please, Captain Harris, please stop carrying guilt for something my father already forgave. Harris pulled her into an embrace. 35 years of grief finally finding release. Thompson and Morgan stood back, tears in their own eyes, witnessing a moment of grace that had been 35 years in the making. Petty Officer Chen stepped forward. Sir, my mother wanted me to tell you something too. She said that after my father died, you sent money every year for my education. Anonymous donations, but she knew it was you. She wanted me to thank you and to tell you that you've honored my father's memory better than anyone could have asked. Harris couldn't speak, could only nod as the weight of decades lifted from his shoulders. Maria's young daughter tugged on her mother's sleeve. Mommy, why is everyone crying? Maria smiled through her tears. Because sometimes, sweetheart, people carry sadness for so long that when it finally leaves, the relief feels like crying. Harris looked at the little girl, the great-granddaughter of the man who had died in this submarine. What's your name, young lady? Rosie, she said shyly. Rosie Rodriguez. That's a beautiful name. Harris reached into his pocket and pulled out the sealed letter he'd carried for 35 years. Rosie, would you do something for me? Would you keep this letter safe? It's something I wrote for your grandmother a long time ago, but I never gave it to her. Now I think it belongs to your family. Rosie took the envelope carefully. I'll keep it safe, I promise. Harris smiled, a real smile, the first Morgan had seen all day. Thank you. He turned to Thompson. You orchestrated this whole thing, didn't you? The timing, bringing Maria here, all of it. Guilty, Thompson admitted. But you needed it. And they needed it too. Closure works both ways. Harris stood and looked around the control room one final time. This is goodbye then. To this place, to the guilt, to the ghosts. They can finally rest. And so can I. 3 months later, Lieutenant Marcus Morgan stood at his desk, reviewing his orders. He'd been accepted to submarine command school, just as he'd hoped. But the officer who would report next month was different from the one who'd stood at the security checkpoint on that October morning. The brass nameplate sat on his desk where he could see it every day. Cap J. Harris. Harris had insisted he keep it, had told him it was more than a piece of metal. It was a reminder of what command truly meant. Morgan's phone rang. He picked it up to hear Admiral Thompson's familiar voice. Morgan, thought you'd want to know. Harris visited Maria Rodriguez last week. gave her father's ring and his final letter. They spent 6 hours talking, sharing stories, grieving together. "How is he, sir?" "Better. Lighter. He's finally living instead of just surviving." Thompson paused. "He asked me to thank you. Said you helped him see himself clearly for the first time in decades." Morgan felt warmth spread through his chest. "I didn't do anything, sir. I just listened. That's exactly what he needed. Someone from the next generation to witness his story and understand its weight." Thompson's voice softened. "You're going to be a fine commander, Morgan. You've learned the most important lesson, that the people matter more than the protocol." After the call ended, Morgan sat in silence, thinking about that day. He'd started it as a rule-following officer, irritated by an old man's presumption. He'd ended it understanding that some experiences transcend regulations, that some burdens are carried across decades, and that true leadership requires the courage to make impossible choices and the strength to live with them. A letter arrived later that afternoon, forwarded from the base. Morgan recognized the handwriting, Captain Harris. He opened it carefully. "Dear Lieutenant Morgan, I'm writing from my garden, where I've just planted 12 oak trees, one for each of the men who died on October 15, 1989. I should have planted them years ago, but I wasn't ready. Now I am. They'll outlive me by centuries, growing strong and tall, providing shade and shelter long after I'm gone." That seems fitting. Maria Rodriguez helped me plant her father's tree. Her daughter Rosie asked if she could visit when the trees are bigger, maybe bring her own children someday. I told her yes, that the trees are for everyone, a living memorial that grows instead of standing still. Petty Officer Chen's mother came too. She's 73 now, but insisted on helping dig. She told me David would have loved the idea of becoming a tree, of continuing to give life even in death. I've started writing to the other families, sharing the idea. Some want to visit, some prefer to remember in their own ways. All of them have been kinder than I deserve. Admiral Thompson tells me you're heading to command school. I'm proud of you, though I have no right to be. We only spent 1 day together. But in that day, I saw something in you change. The certainty that comes from inexperience gave way to wisdom that comes from understanding. You'll be tested someday, Lieutenant. Every commander is. When that day comes, remember that leadership isn't about having all the answers. It's about making the best decision you can with the information you have, and then honoring those who trusted you enough to follow. And when the weight gets heavy, because it will, remember that carrying it is part of the job, but so is eventually setting it down. Don't wait 35 years like I did. Learn to forgive yourself while you're still young enough to enjoy the peace. Fair winds and following seas. Captain James R. Harris, retired. Morgan read the letter 3 times, then carefully filed it in his desk drawer next to the brass nameplate. Someday, when he had his own command, when he faced his own impossible choices, he would read it again. And he would remember the gray-haired man who taught him that true courage isn't fearlessness. It's acting despite fear, living despite guilt, and finding meaning in sacrifice. He looked out his window at the harbor, where the USS Tempest still sat at her berth awaiting decommissioning. In 3 months she'd be towed away. Her service ended. But her legacy would continue in the protocols that bore her name, in the officers who studied her history, and in the lives saved by the lessons learned from one terrible night. Morgan thought about Harris planting trees in his garden, creating life from loss. He thought about Maria Rodriguez, who'd become a doctor to honor her father's sacrifice. He thought about Petty Officer Chen, serving on the same submarine where his father died, turning tragedy into tribute. And he thought about the 12 names on the memorial plaque, names he now knew as people, not just casualties. Rodriguez, who wrote forgiveness in his final moments. Chen, whose son carried his legacy forward. O'Brien, Williams, Patterson, Kowalski, Martinez, and 5 others whose stories Harris had shared throughout that long day. They hadn't died for nothing. They died for each other, for their crewmates, for their mission, and unknowingly for hundreds of thousands of people who would never know how close they'd come to disaster. Their captain had carried that knowledge alone for 35 years. But now the burden was shared, the forgiveness granted, the peace finally found. Morgan stood and walked to the window. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the base. The same light that had illuminated Harris's first steps onto the pier 3 months ago. But everything had changed since then. For Harris, for Morgan, for everyone touched by that October day's revelations. He saluted the USS Tempest, a gesture of respect for the vessel and all who'd served aboard her. Then he returned to his desk, picked up his acceptance letter to command school, and smiled. He was ready, not because he had all the answers, but because he'd learned from someone who'd faced the hardest questions. Captain Harris had given him more than a nameplate or a letter. He'd given him understanding, The knowledge that command requires not just skill and courage, but wisdom and compassion and the strength to forgive yourself when the impossible becomes necessary. Morgan filed his acceptance papers, closed his desk, and headed home. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new lessons, new opportunities to serve. But today he would plant a tree of his own, in honor of a captain who'd finally found peace and the 12 men who'd made it possible. In a garden hundreds of miles away, Captain James R. Harris stood among his oak saplings watching them sway in the evening breeze. Beside him stood Maria Rodriguez and her daughter Rosie, and together they watered the trees that would outlive them all, living monuments to sacrifice, forgiveness, and the enduring power of choosing to live fully, even after loss. The sun set over both gardens, over the naval base, over the USS Tempest resting quietly at her pier, and in the fading light, 12 oak trees and one newly planted sapling stood together, their roots growing deep, their branches reaching toward tomorrow.